All right, I'm going to ask you on one last area before we kind of wrap up. And this is something that kind of, again, overlapped in my area of expertise, or what I see in my practice, is mold illness. And it was something I knew very little about, actually, honestly, like till about 2 years ago. I mean, as my background also in allergy, I did that. That was my fellowship training in allergy and immunology. We saw typically what mold allergy. People could be in a moldy barn where there's a lot of hay. They would start sneezing, wheezing, that type of thing. Sometimes when people had floods in their basement, they would go down there, they would get asthma and wheezing. And then I started getting calls to my practice the last few years because people were desperately seeking somebody that knew how to deal with what's been called now chronic inflammatory response syndrome, or SIRS, or typically due to heavy mold exposure, which is a lot more prevalent than most people realize. And they tend to ignore water damage in their homes and their apartments. And what I found, again, fascinating, this is from Dr. Richie Shoemaker. He's done a lot of work in this area. The overlap, with the symptoms with chronic fatigue syndrome. So I wanted to get your perspective, because you always have such a great view on things. Where you think these patients fall? Is this, again, I mean, because he has a whole very elaborate protocol where he uses cholestyramine and very interesting. He uses certain kind of visual tests to determine if they have biotoxin illness. So just want to get your take on CIRS and chronic fatigue syndrome.
So if you take a look, there's two other areas we probably should cover today, Dean, before we wrap up.
Absolutely.
So in the new edition of From Fatigue Fantastic, there's a very long section called Sensitive to Everything.
Oh, wow.
Because so many of you know they have sensitive to everything.
You get those patients, right? They can't walk into homes, the stores. I mean, everything their life becomes a bubble.
And any treatments they take, they get sensitive to the whole thing. So
right.
The number one, you want to look at mast cell activation.
Yes.
You want to look at food sensitivities. How do you distinguish? Food sensitivities, it's going to be the same food each time. You eat this, you get that. Mast cell activation is totally random. You eat this food or have this exposure 8 days in a row, and then one day you have that same exposure and you just, no. Yeah. And there's no real test for it, but it's very simple. I mean, you go ahead and the book will go through how to use antihistamine, Singulair, quercetin, all the things. And
right.
Try it in this order.
Yeah, that sounds great.
And then you see if you get better, and then you have it.
Right.
But and people are very persistent. You're going to see mold toxins. One of the hallmarks of mold toxin illness is that increased sensitivity. The problem is, we don't know how reliable the tests are yet. Nobody has taken 10 healthy people and done the urine mold toxin test to see what percent are positive. And without that, it's a little hard to interpret, especially when you're then telling people, well, your test, which might be positive in 60% of people walking the street who are healthy, is positive, so you have to do $30,000 worth of mold remediation to your home.
Right.
And so it's a little bit of a Pandora's box to go into. Yeah. But fortunately, for many of the people, their symptoms predated the home that they're in. And that's
interesting. Interesting. Yeah.
And the book goes through the list. So I will do the urine mold toxin test in complex cases that are having persistent symptoms, especially if they have a lot of sensitivity.
Right.
And if the test is positive, the book goes through here the 6 binders, the order to use.
Oh, you do? Oh, great. Oh, great.
It's all laid out.
No, nice, really nice. I like the way you organize things. You make it very clear, which is really nice for the reasons. As I said, your books, more people have come into my office with this book, well read, noted on all the pages, and asking me the kind of questions that keep me on my toes. And of course, I always have you as a resource if I don't know the answer.
But for people with mold issues, I strongly recommend a book called Tox Sick by Dr. Neil Nathan.
Oh, by who?
Dr. Neil Nathan.
I heard about that book, yes, by Neil Nathan.
Brilliant. Mm-hmm. Neil is wonderful. Neil has taken my work, Richie Shoemaker's work, the methylation work, a host of other areas.
Oh, really?
And
combined it all? Yeah, that's great. That's really good to know. What were the other one or two areas you said?